Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Linda Olson, the current president of Aurora. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce Michael T. Bies. Michael is based in Wyoming and is the owner and principal investigator of OW Heritage Research. He has worked as an archaeologist for the BLM and other agencies for over 40 years. He's won many awards, including the Wyoming Archaeology Society's Golden Trowel Award, BLM Wyoming Cultural Heritage Specialist of the Year in 2007, and the American Rock Art Research Association's Conservation and Preservation Award. Mike is currently the chairman of the Washakie County Historic Preservation Commission. Here's Mike.
Okay, hopefully everybody sees that now.
Good.
So we'll just go ahead and get started here. This petroglyph is located where you see that kind of pinkish arrow pointing down into the Rocky Mountains. We're towards the very north end of the Bighorn Basin. Hopefully you can see that star up above. On my screen, it's covered by some stuff, so I'm going to hope you can see it. But basically, you can see it's in the very north end of the Bighorn Basin. It's just south of the Montana border. And what we're going to talk about to start with is the Keelboat, which you see here. And the discovery of the Keelboat was thanks to two ladies, Phyllis Prater and Lynette Kelly Cook. Phyllis rides and Kelly walks, and they cover a tremendous amount of time, or space, not time too, I guess. But they have been searching for a boat petroglyph that someone told them about for a long time. And finally, in 2017, in December, they located it and they got hold of me and took me out and showed me the location. It is not real challenging to get into, but it isn't the kind of place that many people go to. It's just outside of an oil field, got power lines, pipelines, and that sort of thing going by. And this is what you see in panel one. We've got the keelboat, someone on the ground, several people on the boat, and a horse, and what we're interpreting as Fort Raymond. Hopefully, you can see some numbers on your screen. There are 14 panels on this site. This is another site that Phyllis and Lynette found. It's got what I believe to be representations of long-nosed God. There are 3 bas-relief faces and what appears to have been the beginnings of a 4th one. This is located to the south and west of the site we're talking about today. And here you can see a detail of the one. You notice the scarring to pattern the face. And this is an additional one. It's not in bas-relief, but the outline and the interior face markings are very deeply incised. And the lower part of the face is painted red. I personally think that these are perhaps best described as missionaries coming up from the St. Louis neighborhood, likely seeking the obsidian in Yellowstone. There are a half a dozen or so of these within 25 miles of here. And then when you go further east, you'll run into a couple more, but just fellow travelers up the river. This site is just a little bit to the north and west of the site we're talking about today. It has pottery, and it also has Crow celestial drawings on it. And I just wanted to throw that in there to give you an idea of the diversity of the rock art that's right close by. In terms of boat imagery in this region, we've got 30 Mile Mesa, which is up by Pompey's Pillar in Montana. This is a fairly good representation of the panel itself, done in 1949. Clark and Lewis had 2 Paraguays and a keelboat when they left St. Louis. They sent the keelboat back down the river in the spring when they headed up the Missouri. So they never took their keelboat up as far as the Yellowstone. This is a picture of that panel. Fortunately, Timber Bannock drew in the figures so you can see how it's laid out. Note the horses, how graceful they are. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. Here are drawings of the Lewis and Clark expedition Paraguays, and you can see that in all probability, that one in Kramer's drawing and Tim's probably is not one of these. Kramer suspected that the one shown there was the one they built on their return trip downriver. This is a war shirt that shows a different style of keelboat. This is the keelboat style that is very common on the river, both the Yellowstone and on the Missouri in the 1820s, when you get into the kind of the peak of fur trade, I guess. Here are details of those boats. This was likely a military operation against the villages on the Missouri there by modern day Bismarck. Lisa experienced a lot of pilfering from Sioux on the lower and middle Missouri, and he incorporated covered storage spaces on his keelboats after he figured out just how much of a nuisance that was. And here we have a painting that was done by a young Blackfoot man between 1842 and 47 in northwestern Montana or northern Idaho. Up Father Point was part of Father DeSmith's mission there in northern Idaho. And this was theoretically done when he was going downriver and taking this young Blackfoot man with him. Here we see the drawings of the Lewis and Clark expedition keelboat. They only had the one that they took with them. It had a pretty good capacity, about 12 tons. And there's some question as to actually who built it. Major Walker and John Craighead seem to be the most likely, but there's a whole nother set of people who want to believe it was actually built in Pittsburgh, because that was where Lewis originally tried to obtain a keelboat. That individual didn't deliver, so Lewis contracted with somebody else for the boat, and it's likely that it was indeed built in Elizabeth. Here you can see one of the panels from the interpretive display on I-90 in Chamberlain, South Dakota, on the Missouri. Just giving you an idea of what the keelboat looked like in profile. You'll notice the ribbing up here and the cabin in the back. This style is sometimes referred to as the explorer style of a keelboat, as opposed to the keelboats that were used on the Missouri, the lower Missouri, and the Mississippi. Here we see one that's at the Montana State University, built to scale. You can see with the pickup trucks and Suburbans in the background, kind of give you a sense of scale of it. And this is the panel itself. You can see it's very, very difficult to make out much of the imagery if you're standing a ways away. It's very, very keelboat, and that scene associated with it are very finely incised line. There are 14 other panels at the site, and 4 of those just have historic inscriptions. I mentioned earlier that it's in proximity to an oil field, power line, pipelines, a lot of industrial traffic going through the neighborhood. This is a panel that's also located basically just around the corner and in a little nook. It's in a very sheltered area, out of the direct wind. So you get a little bit more detail preserved on the face of it. Here we have a horse, and then we have another one down here. Both of these horses have very horse-looking heads and reasonably good-looking horses. Got a bear paw, some other stuff, just quite a lot of variety in the content of the site. This one is very well protected from the wind. And as a result, there's pigment preserved on it. You can see we've got pecked as well as painted. And then on the main panel, panel number 1, this is the transparency where we traced directly from the rock to get as much detail as we could. Here is an ortho photograph. We use the ortho photograph to trace the images on the computer screen at a very high magnification to get the best possible representation of what is there. The black lines, which you can just barely see, are incised The pinkish is pecked. These pecked images seem to be most likely archaic rather than late prehistoric, based on other sites that have been studied in the area. And then we've got a few inclusions that were incorporated into the image, and also an abraded human body. Here's a detail of the keelboat. Note that you can see a remarkably large amount of detail on the boat. It's got a top sail, it's got stays. You can see the cabin in the back with those ribbings to cover. And you can see here we've got the line used to tow it into shore, presumably. More details. You can see it's got all of the attributes that you would hope to have. Give you a little time to read the screen while we're going through here. And here we can see what I believe, to be the arrival of a keelboat at Fort Raymond. So this would have to be in the second or later visit to Fort Raymond by the keelboats. The first trip up, Lisa had 2 keelboats. The following spring, he took those down to St. Louis, turned around and came back with quite a few more keelboats the next year, I think 6 that year, and then multiple more years of trips. He made his last trip to Fort Raymond in 1813. So his operation there was fairly short-lived. And we know that his keelboats had this structure on the stern, because when Lisa was ready to leave in 1808, Edward Rose, one of his hunters or workers, became very irritated. They wrestled, and Lisa managed to jump on the keelboat, and they pushed off and went downriver. Well, they kept a swivel gun on shore just outside the fort in case the Indians decided to give them some trouble. And Rose torched off that swivel gun and raked the boat from stern to the bow, but no one was injured, which means that that cabin on the rear, that structure on the rear, caught the shot. So like I mentioned earlier, that we've got the stays, we've got the topsail, and we've got a person here just forward of the mast. Now, Lewis and Clark's keelboat did not have a topsail. That was something that Lisa added to the design. The topsail gave Lisa the option of sailing closer to the wind than you would have with just a square sail and a stay sail like Clark had on his. Lisa started out in the fur trade business down in New Orleans, and by the late 1790s, he was operating out of St. Louis. When Lewis and Clark were outfitting their trip, Lisa gave them supplies, well, sold them to them, and also allowed them to use some of his crew. So he was very much involved with Lewis and Clark when they were departing. Here we see a detail of the bow section where we've got the person managing the tow line, the cordell line. They are not attached to the bow. They attach them closer to the mast. If you tie that tow rope directly to the bow, then you're continually pulling the boat into shore. If you tie further back, then you can use your rudder and steer the boat out further into the channel. We've got a detail here. We probably have a lead that he's using to lead the horse. We've got the cordell line coming down to the harness. And note the head is very, very blocky. The legs and the hoofs don't look at all natural. And the tail has this fan-like shape coming out. Kaiser indicated to me that he believed this most likely indicated a Shoshone artist. Yeah, obviously we can't say for certain because it's not signed or anything, right? So we are thinking that it's very likely that it's Shoshone. There are also pieces of Shoshone pottery in the site below the panels. Here we can see a picture of a draft horse pulling a barge on a canal back east in the early 1800s. You'll notice it's very similar to the way the horse is drawn, harness is drawn. It doesn't have the, I forget what you call that strap that goes over the rump, but that's the only thing really that's missing. All of the key parts are there. This type of boat shows up in the river traffic right around 1800. So the fairly new type of boat. There were lots of barges. There were lots of canoes and periquets involved in the trade on the rivers. But the keelboat, with its ability to sail as well as to be poled or rowed, was a fairly new concept at that point in time. So let's see, we're at the end already, huh? How long have I been talking? Just probably not long enough. But at any rate, we got a late start, so it's good that I'm going to finish early. So we know that Lisa used multiple keelboats between 1807 and 1811. A little bit shakier on how many trips he actually made in 12 and 13. Lewis at that point in the game, or Clark, I guess it was Clark, was using him to negotiate with the Sioux lower down on the Missouri and Minnesota and on the Mississippi River also. I guess the Missouri doesn't go through Minnesota, but the lower Missouri, the Sioux were being very difficult. The British were encouraging them to harass the Americans. And Lisa was able to negotiate effectively with them. Now, Kaiser suggested that I examine the records and see if there was any evidence of Lisa's keelboats or Fort Raymond being attacked by the Indians. Lisa was very willing to demonstrate his firepower to the tribes along the river, and he had a fairly large number of men with him every time he went up. So he was never attacked on the river, and Fort Raymond doesn't have any record of ever being attacked by the Indians. We know that the Shoshone were up in this neighborhood because Sacagawea, who was traveling with Lewis and Clark, was a Shoshone woman who'd been captured and sold into slavery, and then eventually sold to the individual that Lewis and Clark hired as one of their interpreters for the trip up the river. She ran into relatives a little further west and north, and they were instrumental in feeding the Lewis and Clark expedition on their way to the Pacific. Some people speculate they wouldn't have made it without that help. She then went downriver on the return trip with Lewis and Clark and lived in the St. Louis area there. So let's see, I skipped some stuff earlier. Okay, so over here on the far right-hand side, you'll see these vertical lines with a series of horizontal lines going through that. That, we believe, represents Fort Raymond, which is why we think this shows the arrival of a keelboat and it being towed into shore at the fort. Fort Raymond has actually never been identified on the ground, despite considerable effort to do that. So if this is indeed showing a keelboat arriving at Fort Raymond, with Fort Raymond being shown in the lower right here, this is the only representation we have of Fort Raymond in the historic record. So I guess at this point, if you want to direct some questions to me, I'll be happy to fill in the details that I skipped earlier.
All right, thank you, Mike. So I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I do have a couple for you. So you just mentioned that being a representation of the fort. Is that because the forts in those days were palisades, and that's what we're seeing?
Right, there are descriptions of the fort that indicate that it's vertical logs with lookouts, however you want to talk about that, on the corners, so that people in the fort would have been able to shoot down along all four of the walls from on top of the wall. Shows good defensive design. Pretty much classic for Western forts. I think we probably all saw it in the Davy Crockett TV shows when we were younger.
Now, I noticed that you had a shirt, an Indian shirt that showed up in the museum in Frankfurt. What's the connection between Frankfurt and this area?
Well, you know, the European museums actually have a better collection of historic materials than the museums in the United States from this part of the world. The Europeans were very, very enthusiastic about the American West, and they collected very, very heavily, starting in the mid to late 1800s.
Okay, so collectors, not necessarily archaeologists.
Say that again?
So they were collectors, not necessarily European archaeologists.
Definitely not European archaeologists. They had money.
Yeah. Okay, so here's some questions. Do you think John Coulter or George Drouillard might have been at your keelboat site? They would have been at Lisa's fort.
Coulter's daughter, granddaughter, I should say, published a biography of Coulter, and she did not show any indication that Coulter had ever been any sort of a draftsman. Drouillard created a map, but he did not draw the map. He described the map to Lewis, I believe it was, might have been Clark, who did the actual drafting of the map. So there isn't really any indication that any of the individuals in Lisa's cruise, if you will, were draftsmen of any sort. There were a couple sort of kind of touristy type guys who may have had those skills, but I've not read a biography by any of them or of any of them to find out whether or not they actually had drafting skills. So there's really, in the historical record, there's nothing to indicate a European was involved in drawing it. And in all probability, when you look at the horse, someone with an art background in the European culture would not draw a horse that looked like that if they were an adult. You might find children drawing horses like that, but not adults. I don't believe. Of course, there's no way of proving who did this.
Yeah. When did
Mr.
the biographical tradition begin?
If Kaiser is on, he can answer that a lot better than I can. It's a phenomenon that starts in the end of the late prehistoric period, extends into the proto-historic, early historic. Right off the top of my head, I can't tell you exactly when. There's some issues with this in terms of being a biographical scene. There aren't any footprints or anything to show the movement of the horse or the human that's on shore, which would be something you would usually see in a biographical scene. So it's a little it's a little bit atypical as a biographical scene, but then of course most biographic scenes don't involve things floating on a river either. So, but anyway, Linnea is there; she can tell you all about that.
Right. I just
I'll,
unmuted her so she can join us here. Hi,
I'll
Linnea.
I'll jump in with a couple of comments. Tracks are shown in biographical scenes if they're important, showing direction of movement, or a lot of times you'll see human footprints go on one way and horse hoof prints coming back the other way. That means the person got a horse, right? So they walked there and rode back. So I think in a case like this, they're near the fort. They could be, if you read the accounts of people going up and down the river, a lot of times they just anchored in the middle of the stream kind of for defensive purposes, because they didn't want the people hanging around the fort to swarm the boat and grab their stuff. So, this horse and person they're not really going anywhere except a little bit outside the fort. And I think that I wouldn't expect to see tracks in a deal like that. I think it's biographic. It looks to me very definitely drawn by a Native American person. The biographic art puts in details where they're important and leaves them out where they're not important to the narrative.
Another factor is that this area down here, if there were tracks and they weren't well executed, we would have missed them. It's a very, very faint tracing. We actually drew this portion of the scene, I think, 4 times. Going out, tracing, coming back, going back out, tracing again. So there certainly could be elements that we're not seeing here.
Yeah, because you don't have the landscape features. You don't have the river. You don't have the ground. You just have the objects.
Uh,
Is that pretty typical?
it would have been nice if they would have put in some diagnostic landscape features that would have helped us figure out where it was.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't. It's not important. They know where this is. They know the boat is in the water. You know, those kind of details don't come in unless they're part of the story or not an obvious part of the story. So, yeah.
And we did have Shoshone pottery here. And Kaiser doesn't feel that this horse looks at all Crow or Blackfoot. And it's very similar to the ones over at Little Barge Bluff in southwestern Wyoming.
Okay, if I can find Jim Kaiser, I'll try to unmute him as well. Here he is. Okay. See if you can unmute yourself, James. There you go.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter.
Oh, there he is.
Great talk, Mike. I agree with Linnea and everybody. There's no need for tracks in this. There's no tracks. And they didn't do landscape things. So everybody knows the boat's in the river and the horse is on the shore and the fort is on the shore. So there's no need for tracks. Yeah, of course it's biographic. It's a really cool scene. I was glad to get a chance to see it firsthand and help Mike a little teeny bit with the tracings of it. It's an incredible scene, and it's the best boat on the plains. I like the boat at Explorers Petroglyph, but this one's lots better. And I think you've done a great job, Mike, in looking at the construction parts and telling us about where the cordell cord was attached and all that, and the sail and whatnot. So yeah, this is biographic. It's great stuff. Not drawn by an Indian. Almost, I have no doubt it's drawn by an Indian. Has all the hallmarks of being an Indian drawing. So go for it. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, thanks. It's true. A European would almost definitely put in some landscape features, wouldn't they? Linnea, yes.
Yeah.
I'll jump in again. Yeah, I mean, they would put in landscape if it was necessary to the narrative. In this case, it isn't,
Yeah.
so it's not there.
It is.
I'm just going to jump in and put in a plug for reflectance transference imaging, which will bring out those very faintly incised lines. I can help you do it in the field. We need a nice, dark, cloudy day. But what it does is it provides a really low light angle. So you can actually bring out the different depths of the incisions.
Yeah, I worked with, I forget their names, Carla and...
Oh, Carla and, yeah, Mud and, I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, we had them out at Legend Rock to do a demonstration of that. And it would be really cool, but unfortunately, I don't have any money.
Nobody has any money.
I didn't mention in the beginning that this was all a volunteer project after I retired.
Yeah, well, speaking of recording, so someone asked, what precautions did you take when tracing to preserve the original art?
Say again?
What precautions did you have to take when tracing in order to make sure you were preserving the original art?
I looked very, very carefully to make sure we weren't putting tape on any of the images. And also, we didn't do it when it was windy. To cut down on the friction, we used acetate. So for much of the time, the film was actually kind of suspended off the surface itself a little bit, not much, but a little bit. And also we used the very, very gentle painter's tape, the blue tape. which doesn't have the strong adhesives that masking tape or something like that does. But other than that, just being careful where we're putting our fasteners, main thing.
Mhm. And then we had another question from someone who was interested in the celestial images, the Aurora, Orion, the Pleiades. Would you have anything more to say on that?
Let me zip back up to that particular panel. This is the one you're referring to. So because of the location of this panel, I was very curious as to whether or not any of these figures might be associated with the crow. So I got Jim to come up and spend a bunch of time with me. He got very, very excited when he saw this whole section over here where these constellation figures are. If you're familiar with Tim, you know that he did his master's thesis on crow astronomical figures. If not, then I apologize for not sharing that to start with. I just kind of figured that was background knowledge. So he was able to identify with a great deal of certainty for him, more than a half a dozen of these as constellations. He talked about some of the others, these strange octopus looking things, but he didn't have a firm opinion about what they were representing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that he's got Orion and Pleiades, since that is in so many people's, star lore. That the Orion is like chasing the Seven Sisters or whatever, the Pleiades, and yet they're not really related in this diagram.
Yeah. This seems to have some solar interactions going on it. It isn't exactly easily accessible from my house. So I've never bothered to try to be out there at the right time of day or anything like that. It's not a particularly attractive camping site unless you're a teenager and you got plenty of booze and girlfriends. But I did suggest to Ivy, who does some solar lunar alignment types of things. And then, of course, COVID happened and everything's kind of gone helter-skelter since then. I'm just now starting to think about going back up there. I've got another, I think, 5 localities to do more than just get a GPS point and photograph them. I haven't done any tracings or drawings or anything like that on them.
So is that a good sky viewing site?
Say that one more time.
Is that particular site good for viewing the sky?
Yeah, it is.
Does it have a view of the sky?
Is it a good site for viewing the sky? Yeah.
Oh yeah. You're almost all of these places are very, very nice dark sky places. Even today with the oil field.
Yeah.
You've got Deaver and Franny, 5 or 10 miles away. Neither one of them really have an impact on the night sky in terms of their lights. The oil field lighting and such is all beyond the rim of the canyon, so it's going up, not coming across your vision line. It would be fun to get somebody who's interested in that sort of thing out there. Maybe Ivy hasn't been up here in the basin the last couple of years, so I haven't had a chance to talk to her since COVID's been over with. I shared the location with her so she'd go there if she wanted to by herself, but I don't believe she has.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and while we're talking about the sky, we had a message relating to the Native American shirt. So I'll just read this to you as a comment. The writer says, keep in mind that Americans, starting in the mid 1800s to early 1900s, took Native Americans throughout Europe to parade them in Wild Wild West type shows. And at times, some of these individuals died and were buried in Europe. Because of this, there are all sorts of Native American items throughout the European museums. Germany in particular seem to be so enamored with Native Americans that although they have no Native Americans there, they have powwows every year and they themselves dress up in full regalia. Okay, so that's an interesting comment of European interest in the Native Americans. Thank you for that.
I'm really not quite sure how to react to that.
So that shirt, I can't remember if it's in Frankfurt, right? So I think that's the German Leather Museum, and they acquired all kind of stuff.
Weltkulturen Museum, so world culture.
Oh, that's the ethnographic museum. But there is a leather museum that has a great deal of painted robes and different things from the plains, because it's all about leather. I'm gonna go back
Is that
to
also in Frankfurt?
I don't know where it is. I have to look it up. So going back to your sky for a second, just for benefit of people listening, it's actually not Aurora Borealis, Corona Borealis, the northern crown. A lot of groups call that the camp circle. I don't think the Crow call it that. You'd have to look.
No, I think they call it the Aurora Borealis, based on Tim.
Corona Borealis. Aurora Borealis is northern lights. But they do recognize, like, Orion is the hand. It's really the wrist, and a lot of groups have that. It goes with the story of the sacred twins. I mean, all of these things have stories that go with them, that lead to other stories, that lead to other stories. So I think it's very cool that these things are up there on the rock. I have not seen a very convincing example of that before. Although
it is pretty
the other
cool.
one I'm thinking of that's semi-convincing is pretty near there, so it makes sense.
Yeah, the day you were up, we didn't have time to go back into this one when you came to the Keelboat site.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't we leave it at that? Lots of interesting stuff to ponder. And I'd like to thank you, Mike, for your presentation. Thank everybody for your comments and questions. And hope that we see some of you live in Visalia next month. And we're going to be taking a break in our online lecture series for the in the meantime. I guess there's one last comment I will just mention. Dominguez Archaeological Research Group in Colorado recently recorded a similar boat image near Canyon Pintado, which has a mast and punt poles. So there we go. And with that, I guess, thanks again.
What kind of a boat did they find?
Similar. It had a mast and punt poles.
Huh.
So Dominguez Archaeological Research Group in Colorado. Probably maybe do a search.
I wonder if that would be on the Platte River or close to it.
Yeah, it was near Canyon Pintado, it says.
Yeah, I don't do Southwest.
Yeah. Yeah, so these boats must have definitely fascinated the Native Americans to see these things showing up.
The Keelboats were heavily used on keelboats were heavily used on the Platte as well as on the Missouri. So certainly a possibility.
Yep. All right. So thanks to everybody. Hopefully we'll see you at the conference in May.